I think we can get started. We are live on YouTube as well. Good evening all. Thank you for joining this session. So this is the third meetup we are having this month. We had two back-to-back meetup last week, and today we have the privilege of having Thomas Maurer, who is the Senior Cloud Advocate at Microsoft, who is joining us all the way from Switzerland. And he's part of the Azure engineering team in cloud and AI space. Thomas is located in Switzerland, and he's also an ex-MVP. So it's a very good privilege for us to have him and present on this wonderful topic of managing the hybrid environment using Azure Arc. So without any further delay, I would like to invite Thomas and hand it over to him. Over to you, Thomas.
Perfect. Thank you, Nilesh. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to really say it's a pleasure to be here and speak with you virtually, and it's an honor. But hopefully I come back in person one day to speak with all of you in person. I really start to miss the human connections and everything. So, but again, I want to take that opportunity again to say thank you. And so my name is Thomas Maurer. I'm as already said, I'm a cloud advocate working at Microsoft, and we are part of the Azure engineering team, which means we are more or less directly working with the different feature teams within Azure. So when they have like requests, we can basically work with them. And our job really is, if you look at it on a very high level, it's two main things. So one of them is obviously creating content and delivering content. That can be like Microsoft Docs, can be blogs, videos, user groups like this, or also Microsoft Ignite and Ignite the Tour. The other big part we are working with is feedback. So we are collecting feedback from our customers and communities to see, hey, what is working for our customers, what is not working, and how can we basically improve this this service, and this helps then the feature teams to basically adjust and work on their services. So if you have anything you want to talk about, things which are working great, things which do not really work great, which like you wish you could do, please reach out to me. We can definitely have a look at that. Let me also quickly share my screen here, because then I can go into the introduction here. So let me open this up. So perfect. So again, I'm part here. You also have my contact information on the screen itself. You can reach out on Twitter or LinkedIn or directly on my blog if you wanted to. Now, in this presentation, we are going to talk about Azure Arc and how you can actually join, what it is, and how you can actually join servers. We're going to talk about especially about servers, because that's the part we can show today. But that also works for other services as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit why we are doing this, what that actually means, and how it actually works. I also prepared a couple of different demos, so I really want to make it sure that you can actually see what is going on. And then at the end, will have time to answer some questions if I can, and we'll see what you come up with. So as you can see, I will quickly switch to my slide deck here. So hybrid for us is a really important topic. And before I go on, before I go into the product demo, I want to quickly talk about why it's actually important and why we see that demand and why we are doing what we are doing. And one thing we can see is that together with the cloud, the environments our customers have are getting increasingly complex. So one thing we can see is that IT teams and administrators and operations and also developers are working and managing like hundreds, if not thousands, of different applications. And some of them are very new applications. They're very modern applications built on modern languages like .NET Core, or they're built on PaaS services. They're built on containerized solutions, serverless solutions, and so on. But then a large set is also working in traditional virtual machines and even on physical servers. And IT departments really need to take care of all of that, right? If you are working for a company which is not just a startup and just started with it, it's highly likely that you have a large mix of different applications you need to manage. Another big challenge and something which adds complexity is the diverse infrastructures of many of our customers. So usually customers sometimes have different data centers, multiple data centers they need to manage. They have branch offices, stores, factories, even like some edge cases where they run IoT, for example, and they need to take care of all of that, right? So they need to manage like systems which are running at different places, and they want to have the management solution for this. And let me switch. The last one is we can see that customers are doing multi-cloud, right? Even though that a lot of customers are deciding Microsoft Azure as their main cloud, which by the way is a very good choice, often they use multiple cloud providers. And this can have multiple reasons. This can be historically, right? Before they started using Azure and saying, hey, Azure is our main cloud provider. Some departments maybe already or teams already used other cloud providers. Or in some cases, they just say, hey, that's our strategy. We just want to have some services from other cloud providers. And again, that is fine, but it adds more and more complexity. So our IT teams really need to take care of all that complexity and all need to manage that. So it doesn't get easier, right? Especially if you're coming from a traditional company, which you had like your own data centers, your own servers and virtualization. And then you move to the cloud where you get all this modern infrastructure and opportunities. So you basically just have all of that which you need to manage. So many of you probably have seen the Ignite 2019 keynote back in Orlando last year. But I want to highlight one thing, and that was the second keynote, which was done by Jason Sanders. He is the engineering lead of all of the Azure teams. He directly reports to Scott Guthrie, and so he has all the engineering teams which actually built the services underneath him. So he's basically making sure that everything which gets developed is done in the right way and makes sense. And he had the keynote directly after Satya Nadella, and obviously they were talking a lot about hybrid because we had a lot of announcements in the hybrid space. And what he said, and that's very important, is that hybrid is a end state for our customers and not just an in-between state until everything is moved to the cloud. Because we see that customers, they probably run, let me take one example, they run certain business critical applications. Those can be, for example, in factories, where they don't want to rely on the cloud, right? They don't want to rely on the internet connectivity, which doesn't really work really well or they have regulations in place where they can't really go out and use an Azure region outside of their country, or just like applications which can't deal with the latency. So there are many, many reasons why we see that some companies are really, or most of the companies probably, are going into a hybrid state where they run lots of workloads in the cloud, all of that, which makes sense, but they're also running workloads wherever they need, in their own data center, at the edge, and stores and branch offices, or even at other cloud providers. And that is very important. I'm going to use the word hybrid, or very much. And for us, hybrid is not just on-prem and Azure anymore. Hybrid, if we talk about hybrid, really, it becomes of like wherever your server or system is running, right? I'm going to talk a lot about server, but this is not just limited to server, as you will see in the presentation. This was also, like, for example, if you run Kubernetes clusters and so on, you can also leverage that as well. And so what a lot of people don't really understand or didn't remember is Azure was really built like with hybrid in mind, right? It was like hybrid by design is the word we use very often, because we have a lot of hybrid services already in place. Before we even had Azure Stack or Azure Arc, we already had those hybrid services. And so this slide, I will show that at the end again, a little bit deeper, but what it shows is basically in a nutshell what our hybrid offering is. And again, there's much, much more behind all of these offerings here. But think about Azure IoT. I'm not going to talk too much about this because we don't have too much time for that. But that obviously is also one of our hybrid offerings, right? This is where we basically can connect IoT devices from the edge to the cloud and then run some advanced analytics, for example, or manage these devices from the cloud. The other big thing we had, and the people are always looking at, was Azure Stack. And Azure Stack really is not just a single product anymore. It's now a portfolio or a family of products and services and solutions, if you will, where we basically help you to get some hardware into your locations where you need it, which are Azure inspired or Azure consistent, and basically also allow you to deploy Azure services. And then what we're going to talk about mostly will be the middle thing, which is the big announcement around Azure Arc, which really is designed to basically run Azure services and use Azure management on any infrastructure, on any location, on any cloud. And that is basically the big vision, and that is what we're going to have a look at in this presentation. However, I mentioned that we already have a ton of hybrid products as well, which a lot of people already forgot about because we were not really doing a great job in advertising them. But if you look at the Azure management tools, for example, if you look at update management, if you look at Azure Backup, Azure Site Recovery, if you look at DevOps, where we have Azure DevOps, but we also have Azure DevOps Server, which you can run in your location. If you look at our security solutions with, like, for example, if we come to identity with Azure Active Directory, where you can connect your on-prem directory as well, or then even with our new services like Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel, where you again can connect systems to Azure wherever they are running. So that is really a lot of things here we have to offer, and Azure Arc really is the one which will help us to connect these services better together. So this slide I really want to have like really quickly because I want to show you a couple of demos, but this is really important because I want to explain to you a little bit of Azure Arc. So again, you can think of, on the top you can see we have Azure, and then on the bottom you can see different parts. So we have, for example, our customers running again IoT devices. They run, for example, Azure Stack with Azure Stack Hub, Azure Stack HCI, or Azure Stack Edge, which is basically really giving them a great infrastructure depending on their needs, right? And again, I'm not going too deep in the different solutions here, but we can maybe talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. But then we also have customers which say, hey, we have on-prem virtualization on VMware. We are using other cloud providers. So we want to still run these Azure services on-prem as well. And that is one part where Azure Arc comes in, is by bringing these Azure services to your location. And the other part is really the big line in the middle where Azure Arc really becomes the connection or the bridge between Azure and these services to build that single control plane. So that is what we are going to have a look at, is basically about that control plane, as well as a quick look at how we can bring Azure services to any infrastructure. So this presentation, again, because when we announced Azure Arc, we had a couple of pieces together. This one is really focusing about server, and I'm going to show you the different examples, because the server part is a really good example of how we're going to do that, and everyone basically understands how a server works, and so we're going to take that as an example. However, there is much more behind this. So again, what we already can, we announced that at Build as well, is connecting Kubernetes clusters, and I will talk a little bit about that later on, but that's another example of what we actually can connect. So what does this single control plane currently offer us? And again, when I talk about on-prem or hybrid, I really mean on-prem, multi-cloud, or edge. So the first thing really is organizing and govern resources at scale, right? I remember when we started with Azure, and probably many of you as well, it was very like, at one point you start using it, you have a lot of different objects which you need to manage, right? A lot of different resources. And so you were basically, we realized you need a tool to organize and manage all of that, right? That is where Azure Resource Manager, for example, came in and helped us to manage that using tags, using subscription management, using resource groups, using policies and all of that to manage our environments. And so people were coming to us and saying, hey, that would be great if we can use that also for our resources running outside of Azure. And that is one thing we're going to have a look at. The other parts are, for example, also to bring developer practices to on-prem. So if you're using DevOps or deployment to Kubernetes clusters and stuff like that in Azure, you probably want to extend this and use the same practices you're using the cloud to also use that on-prem, and that is also where the single control plane can help. And then last but not least, it's about implementing security features to your on-prem environments, which you were able to leverage that in Azure, but then also extending that to your on-prem environment. So for that, I really want to switch now to a quick demo, because that is how I can make my point here. So let me switch, and you should now see my screen here, and I'm in the Azure portal, and you can see here I'm at all resources. So I see all my Azure resources. You can see here I have like the Azure firewall deployed, I have public IP addresses, virtual machines, disks, databases, and so on. And as I said, people were saying, hey, this is great to now manage that stuff, but what about on-prem resources or resources at other cloud providers? I want to use that to manage my on-prem servers as well and organize them as well. So what I'm going to show you here is how you actually can do this. And so I'm just going to limit this quickly for machines. So I'm going to say, hey, I want Azure virtual machines. And I want to see my servers I already joined using Azure Arc, which are running, for example, on-prem in my data center. So I'm going to select this. And you can now see here that I have my Azure VMs, but also my on-prem servers, which are running in my data center. And to be honest, they're just running underneath my desk here. But in production, that would be like your data center, or they would run in another cloud provider. And you can see here, I can see them side by side. I can now easily go and let's like group them, for example. And you can see every resource here is basically joined to a resource group. It has a Azure region. It's part of an Azure subscription. And I can also use tags. So for example, I have a location tag where I tagged, for example, my Azure servers, my Azure virtual machines here with the location in which Azure data center they're running. But I can also now start tagging, for example, the location of my on-prem servers as well. So I can use the exact same, and if I create reports, I can do that as well. I can also do, for example, like what I use cost center tag to organize my resources and like my resources in different cost centers or departments. So what I can do here, I can, for example, go and add a filter. And let's say I'm using a tag, like let's use the cost center tag. And I want to see all my servers as part of cost center 1001. I can now limit that, and I can easily see like now my Azure VM next to my Arc VM. Very, very simple. So I can basically have that overview and organize my resources. Now, you probably say, okay, Thomas, that's fine, but like there is probably more to it, and absolutely. So this is not just in the portal. You can also go and, for example, go and do the same thing in Azure Resource Graph or use PowerShell. So if you're not familiar with Azure Resource Graph, it basically helps me to run queries across my environment and basically see what is going on across my subscriptions. So here I'm running a query which basically just gives me really quickly the data on how many Azure Arc servers I have, and then how many virtual machines I have. And then if I wanted to, I can also go and create a chart on this, and I can then see, hey, this is what's going on. So very, very simple, right? But I want to make the point that this is not just a portal. This is also, I can run this using PowerShell, the CLI, or the API. Again, Azure Arc systems, they show up like an Azure resource. Now, since we have this available, I mean, this is great to now just have that overview, but I want to do a little bit more. So, for example, if we are going to Azure Policy, I can do a couple of more things. And if you're not familiar with Azure Policy, there are multiple things. This is not just related to Azure Arc. This is really related to Azure for a very long time. And Azure Policy allows us basically to configure our Azure environment the way we want it, and then still give developer or IT operations access to Azure so they can keep on the speed and agility the cloud promises to them, but we can still stay in control, right? So we can, for example, say, hey, you're only allowed to deploy services in a certain Azure region. So a developer cannot just go and create VMs in the US region, in the Europe regions, or wherever. They can really also just like limit them and say, hey, we only want them like to create VMs in the APAC regions, for example. Or this is also for other services as well, right? I'm talking now about VMs because that's very natural to me, but that also like could go for databases or app service and so on. Another part is like you can, for example, say which resources can be deployed. So this can be, for example, I want to like block certain VM types from being deployed. So in Azure, we have these great new VM types, the MV2 series VMs. I think they have like around 400 cores, 12 terabytes of memory, and they drain your credit card in like 3 seconds. So you don't want every developer just going out and like deploying the largest machine, which also obviously costs the most money. So you can do certain limitations. Now, Azure Policy does not only have like policies for the Azure environment, you can also go out and use Azure Guest Configuration Policy to manage the operating system of an Azure VM. So you can say, hey, I want to audit my VM that I have the necessary security settings in place for that specific VM. And if not, I want to see that this VM is not compliant with my company regulations. And I want to fix that. And that is what I'm quickly going to show you how that actually works, because this is something we can also use with Azure Arc VMs as well. So the first thing I would do, I would create a new assignment. And I'm going to do that with an initiative, which is basically just a collections of different policies. And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to look for one which says, hey, I want to audit all my VMs with insecure password settings. So I want to go out and see, hey, which VM does have insecure password settings. I would then just select this and then basically go out and assign that policy to my subscription or my resource group or even my management group, wherever I want it. I already have done that because that takes a couple of minutes to basically go out and audit my environment. So I already prepared this. Now, I want to now see where I'm actually compliant and where I'm not. So if I go to compliance, you can now see here all the initiatives and policies I assigned, and you can see here for some of them I am compliant, which is great. And then some of them I'm not compliant, right? And so I want to probably have a look at my environment and see, hey, what's the problem here? So one of them I showed you is, for example, audit VMs with insecure password settings. So if I click on this, again, I get some more information here about this, if it loads, please. Yes, here we go. So you can see here, I can see the password settings and so on, and I can see here all the policies which I'm actually checking, and you can see some of the policies here I'm fine. Here, the green ones I'm fine, but here I have a couple of them which like are not correctly configured on my Windows and Linux machines. So I want to find out which resources are affected. So I can just go out and say, hey, I want to see the non-compliant resources. And the first thing I want to show you here really is that these are all the systems which are not compliant. And what you can see here, I can see here a VM running in Azure, but I can also see VMs which are joined using Azure Arc and running in my data center. So I can now go out and audit these VMs which are running in my data center. And what I can now go is I can now go out and reach out and say, hey, what is the server owner of, for example, Ubuntu 0.2? And then reach out to him and tell him, hey, that is what you need to do to make your server compliant with our company policies, right? When it comes to password security, for example. And this one, again, just to be very clear here, this can be a virtual machine running on-prem or at the other cloud provider, but this can also be a physical machine running somewhere, right? So this is not limited to just VMs. And then the other thing I could do is basically I could go out and say, hey, let's just create a remediation task and let's just roll out this change to all the VMs, right? So I could go out and say, hey, I want to fix that setting on all the VMs. So that is a quick demo about the control plane, and I want to quickly switch back to the slide deck. So quickly go through that. And so how do we make that possible? And with that, I want to quickly talk about that slide here, because this is a high-level overview for Azure management. And no worries, we will make that easy. We start on the left side with as an Azure customer. And what we are going to do is basically we are interacting with Azure. Whenever we are working with Azure, we are either using the portal, PowerShell, the CLI, we're going to use APIs or whatever to basically work then with Azure. And what we're actually doing is we are interacting with something called the Azure Resource Manager. That is the magic behind all of what's happening in our Azure environment, and gives us a couple of tools like organizational wise and also security wise. Control, it gives us the whole subscription management, it gives us logs, tags, policies, for example, which I just showed you to make sure that we can govern our environment. And then we have on the top, we have a couple of management services like Azure Update Management, monitoring, and all that. And today, all of that was just designed for Azure services, right? So we could use that for Azure VMs, databases, Service Fabric, Kubernetes, web apps, serverless, machine learning, whatever you have. We had basically Azure Resource Manager managing all of that. Now, people were telling us, as I mentioned, this is great. This is great to finally get a great organizational overview and manage our Azure resources. But we also have resources which are outside of Azure, right? So what Azure Arc now does is it extends Azure Resource Manager to services. Right. So today you can see here, I'm listing here servers, Kubernetes clusters, and data services. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, what that means. But those are now services which we can now connect to Azure Resource Manager using Azure Arc, right? So if I have an on-prem server, I can connect it to Azure Resource Manager, as you just saw, and then it shows up in the portal. Or if I have an on-prem Kubernetes cluster, I can also connect that to the Azure Arc systems as well, manage that from Azure. When I say on-prem, I obviously always mean as well like other cloud providers, right? So if you have a Kubernetes cluster running at another cloud provider, you can connect that too. And again, this is not here to replace your local only tools, right? So if you're using your server admin tools for your managing your servers on-prem, you're going to keep using these, right? There should be no dependency on Azure to just manage your systems. If you're running Kubernetes on-prem, you're still going to use your native Kubernetes tools you're using to manage that cluster, but you get that extended management capabilities we have in Azure. And the same thing for example, if you use Azure Data Services. Now, the last part, Azure Data Services, is a little bit different from that, because that enables us also to now run Azure SQL and Azure Postgres at the customer's location, right? This is not just connecting an existing SQL database server or whatever. This is bringing Azure SQL to your customer's on-prem location. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. So let me actually show you how that would work in a customer environment and how you would actually work with Azure Arc. So I'm back in the Azure portal here, and the easiest way is just to search for Azure Arc, or in my case, I just click here on Azure Arc. And what you can see today is the three options I just told you, right? So I have organize and govern all your servers. So that is what we're going to have a look at today. But then you can also add your Kubernetes clusters running on-prem. And what you can do here, you can use, for example, policies to secure your Kubernetes cluster and make sure that you're compliant with your company policies. In the same way, you can do that for servers, but again, for Kubernetes. And then you can also use that to basically do app deployment on these Kubernetes clusters. So what you can do, for example, is you can check in your code of your containers into a Git repository, and you can set up that this then automatically will deploy to that specific Kubernetes clusters, not just running in Azure, but also running on-prem, using technologies like GitOps to make that possible. And then the last one, as I said, this is the data services part. That's currently in private preview. So for that, you need to sign up and basically connect with the team. And what you can do is really, you can bring Azure SQL or Azure Postgres to your on-prem environment, right? So this allows you to run the same flexibility of Azure SQL, which you run in Azure, but running that on-prem. And again, that is what customers are telling us, right? They're saying, hey, we're super happy with, for example, Azure SQL, but we have certain workloads which you can't move to an Azure region, because again, it could be regulations, it could be compliance reasons, it could be network latency reasons. So we want to use Azure SQL on-prem, and Azure Arc enables this. So today, again, I'm going to show you the one part with the servers, but again, it works basically the same thing with Kubernetes clusters as well. So here you can see all my servers I already joined, right? So you can see they show up here. You can see they are joined as every Azure resource to a resource group, a region, and a subscription. So if I have a look at one of these servers, for example, let's take this one here. If I click on it, let me see, go back quickly. I want to show you one which is actually connected. So let me take app01. I know that is working. So here you can see here that I have this server which runs on-prem. You can see here it looks like an Azure resource, right? It again is joined to an Azure region. It's joined to a subscription. You get some additional information. For example, here, what operating system is this server running? I can then go and use activity log. I can also see role-based access control. So I can say, hey, you have an Azure user, but you're not allowed to see the servers you shouldn't have access to, right? I can now go out and say, hey, the SharePoint administrator can only see the SharePoint servers in the Azure portal. I can then use things like logs and tags. So for example, I can see that this server here does not have a tag assigned. So I can just go and basically say, hey, I have a location tag here. And I want to say that this server is here in my Zurich data center, like my on-prem data center. And I can assign that specific tag to this server, like I would do it with an Azure service as well. So after a couple of seconds, you can see here it's assigned. The other part I want to show you quickly is the policy part. So I showed you that before, and before I had a view over all my servers in my environment, which are not compliant. This time I'm looking at it and I only see the policies which are assigned to that specific server. So now if I'm a server admin, I can basically see, hey, these are the policies assigned to my system. And here I see, yeah, most of them are fine. But what about this one? Like, for example, here, there's a VM. And I'm not compliant with that setting. So this server should be set to a time zone, which is UTC +1, but it isn't. So I can see, hey, okay, what is going on here? What should I do? And then I could, for example, do two things. I could now go out on my server and change it, or I could create a remediation task, and it would basically go out and change that setting on my server. Now, this again, we are currently in public preview, sorry. So not all of these functionality is currently working, but that's something you try out. Again, the remediation task, for example, is something which is quite limited yet, and do that. Another part here is logs. So if you're familiar, log analytics is not something new. It exists for a while, and it basically also allows us not just connect logs from your from your Azure servers or Azure systems. Now you can also connect, obviously, machines running outside of Azure. Now, if I have deployed the log agent, and I hope I did, yes, I did. So the problem was always, if I want to give an administrator access to the logs of that servers in Azure, in Azure Log Analytics, I had to give them access to the log analytics workspace. So he would see all the logs of all the different servers and systems which are connected to that. Now with Azure Arc, I get only access to the logs of that specific server here. So I only have access to these logs, which is fine because I'm the admin of that server. And so what I can do, for example, I can run then queries using the keyword query language, or for some of you, maybe also known as Custo. And you can see here for this, it's a very simple query just to see what updates are there on that system. And you can see here, what are they installed or are they needed? So I can quickly see, okay, there's an update needed for this, for example. But obviously this also works, as you can see, with a lot of other different logs for that system, which I can then basically go through and browse the logs for and run queries on. Now, how do I actually join a server now? I was talking about how everything works, but how do I add a server? Adding a server is very, very simple. So for that, we just go to add, and the team here created a wizard to add a server, which basically creates a script for you, which does then all the plumbing in the backend. So you have very easy to set this up. We have two options here. The first one is running an interactive script. So this will basically, hey, run that script, and then you will need to log in on that machine to basically connect that server. But if you want to do that on scale, you don't want to log in on all the servers, so you can create a script which uses a service principal in Azure, which only has rights to join servers to Azure Arc, right? So we give them like the minimum privileges or permissions to onboard servers. Now, let's have a look at the generate script part, because that explains everything really, really nicely. So if we want to join a server, again, it needs to be part of a subscription. It needs to be part of a resource group. It needs to be part of a region. So today we can choose between 4 different regions. Again, we are in public preview, so not all regions are available. So for us, let's go South Asia. And then we can choose if that's a Windows or Linux machine. Let's say this is a Windows machine, but again, it works perfectly fine with Linux machines as well. If that machine is behind a proxy, I can also configure the proxy settings here. And then I can already add tags. So you saw that I quickly used the location tag, for example, and tagged my machine. I can already add that before I even while I'm joining the server, or I can do that later. And the last thing, I then want to review that script. I can then go and download it, or if I want to just have a look and copy it, you can see here on my screen, I can basically go out and copy that script. And what it does, it downloads the agent, which is in the Windows world, it's a MSI file. Then it installs that specific agent, and then it basically runs the last command, which then basically registers your system against that Azure tenant with the right subscription and the right resource group, etc. So it's very simple. You would just copy that and run that on the machine as well. And again, if you want to do it on scale, you would do that with a can I say it, with a service principal name to make sure that you can run that automated around against 100 different servers without the need to log in on everyone. So that is how you do that. And then the server, after a couple of seconds or minutes, will show up here, and you can start managing it directly from Azure. So let me switch back to the slides. This was the quick demo about onboarding the server as well. So these are the key takeaways for Azure Arc for servers. I highlighted most of them, but I quickly want to go through them. The first one is inventory. So you can join Windows and Linux servers. They can be physical and virtual machine and virtual. These can be running in your own data center or at a hosted cloud or another service provider. And it's completely domain agnostic. There's also no VPN or anything needed. It's just this agent which has an outbound HTTPS connection to Azure. Right. There's also no ingoing ports. Again, no VPN, nothing needed except for internet connectivity to Azure in that case. You can then start using governance and security tools by using built-in policies right now. So, for example, I can show you the policy part. So you can basically go out and have your security or regulation policies or also settings policies, which you just want to make sure that the server is configured in the right way. You can use role-based access, so you can go and say, hey, for the application admin for this specific applications, only for this specific application, only sees the server he manages, right? He needs to manage, and he doesn't see all the other things. If you are a managed service provider, you'll also be delighted that you can use Azure Lighthouse to basically manage these systems, right? So if you have multiple customers with multiple tenants, where you manage that using Azure Lighthouse, you can also leverage Azure Arc with Lighthouse. And then this basically all gives you the searchable inventory, the portal experience. I just showed you, you can use tags and all of that. And you can imagine that customers that we are now building more and more on top of this, right? Policies and logs are just two examples we have currently available in this preview, but the team is listening to customer feedback and prioritizing which feature should be added to the capabilities of Azure Arc for servers or Azure Arc enabled servers. So these are questions we have. Those are also things I'm very interested in. What features do you want to see? Do you want to, for example, see Azure Security Center, update management, change tracking, backup, and all these features? Would that be interesting? And if yes, what would you like to see first, right? So again, I can also share some background information later on this. Now, to sum this up a little bit, I talked about this, that Azure Arc is not just limited to what I just showed you. one thing really what Azure Arc does well, it's organizing and govern resources across your environment. And when we speak about this, this is not limited to servers. Again, today, this is also Kubernetes clusters. We also get app management at scale for Kubernetes clusters. Again, I talked about this, where you can basically deploy applications directly using a technology called GitOps to deploy that. And then the last one, really, I talked about that as well, about bringing Azure data services like Azure SQL and Azure Postgres to your on-prem environment, or to the edge, or to your branch offices, or even other cloud providers. So you can run Azure SQL on another cloud provider as well. Now, people are asking, how do I do that actually? So the requirement to run Azure SQL or like parts of the Azure Arc data services is the only thing you need is a Kubernetes cluster, right? So if you want to run Azure SQL on-prem, the only thing is you need to run a Kubernetes cluster. If you want to run Azure SQL in another cloud provider, the thing you need is basically a Kubernetes cluster. So to wrap this up a little bit, I want to give you a little bit of an architecture view. And again, it's kind of like similar as the one before. So we start on the left side. Again, if we are interacting with Azure in general, we are using the Azure portal, CLI, PowerShell, the SDK, APIs, whatever. But we are really working with Azure Resource Manager. And now what Azure Arc is, this is all the technologies in blue. Can be used basically to extend this. So one part is the Azure Arc Server Resource Provider, which again connects to that specific Azure Arc Server agent. This one connects then to the back to the resource provider, and you can then manage your Linux and Windows servers as well. Then for Azure Arc Kubernetes, we also have a resource provider, again with an agent for your on-prem Kubernetes cluster, where you then can basically connect back and manage that. And then the last one is the data services part, which needs a Kubernetes cluster to run, and then you deploy the Azure Data Services agent on it, and it can basically run today in private preview Azure SQL or Azure Postgres there as well. And again, this is not there to replace your local tools. You can still use your local tools like Azure Data Studio, your native Kubernetes tools, or your server admin tools you're using to manage your servers. But again, it gives you that extended experience. And this, you saw that slide before. I really want to wrap it up with this. Again, this is just part of our hybrid story. There is much, much more. If you're interested in, for example, update management, if you look at Azure Sentinel, which is our cloud-based SIEM, if you look at Azure Security Center, if you look at Azure DevOps, there's much, much more going on, as well as our Azure Stack part as well. And again, one question I already want to follow up with is, like, because I get that a lot, is Azure Arc replacing Azure Stack? And the answer to that is no. They're like addressing different use cases. So Azure Arc basically can run on any infrastructure. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be a Microsoft virtualization platform or anything. But Azure Stack, for example, gives you the Azure-inspired infrastructure to run in any data center and gives you that consistent experience. So they work for different use cases, but they're also working very well together. So for example, you could run a Kubernetes cluster on top of an Azure Stack Hub system and connect that using Azure Arc to Azure, so you can get the advantage of, like, for example, policies and also the app management as well. So all those solutions work together in that sense. So with that, I want to say thank you for your time. I hope we have a couple of questions. I really want to encourage you, if you have any feedback or if you have questions, to reach out to me as well.
Thanks, Thomas. There is already one question from Asif in the meetings chat. It's about the on-prem VM and virtual machines. The question is how we will add in Microsoft Arc and Arc services will be changed to the manage on-prem VM?
So if I understood this, the question is, how do we actually add these services? And in all these cases, really, it comes down to the specific agent, right? So it's basically downloading a agent and installing that, and then registering this to our Azure subscription on Azure tenant, and then we will basically show up. This system will then show up, and that works the same for servers, for Kubernetes clusters, and for data services as well. There's always only an encrypted outbound connection to Azure. So it's like over HTTPS connecting to certain Azure APIs. That is basically what we have there as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think we have a follow-up question as well. Which type of logs collected by Arc agent from on-prem servers?
So for logs, that's a very good question. So for logs, we are using not just the Azure Arc agent, we are still using in the backend the Microsoft monitoring agent, the MMA agent. And so everything you can get through the MMA agent, you can also use and see in the Azure Arc scenario. If you're familiar with Azure Log Analytics, you can basically go out and enable different solutions, which then pump up more of the different logs, right? You can also go out and select the different logs you want to get out of performance logs or event logs data. It really depends on how much you want delivered to Azure. The more information you need, the more logs you will need to send. The more cost is obviously involved in Azure Log Analytics, but again, you can also limit that to, like, say, hey, I want to only have this specific logs available.
And from a costing point of view, how much does it cost? Let's say, is it per VM, or how is the costing model work in this case?
Yeah. So currently we do not have, we are currently in public preview and for some parts even in private preview. So there is no, right now, let me be clear, right now there's no additional cost for Azure Arc servers, right? There is no cost in like just adding that Azure Arc agent and using policy, for example, to manage these server. There is a cost, obviously, by using the logs, because you have the log analytics workspace, so you pay per gigabyte for the specific logs you send up to there. So it's really a pay-per-use model there. We did not really announce anything on the well, we did not announce on the server side. We did also not announce anything on the Kubernetes side, and we did also not announce anything on the data services side. However, I believe that there will be certainly some costs on the data services side, because obviously you run something in your data center, while with Azure Arc for servers, you're basically just managing that. So we will see again how that will turn out, but we did not today. It's free to use except for the log analytics data if you try it out in the preview, right?
Okay, I had a question around the high availability and business continuity disaster recovery kind of scenario. I saw in the portal that you have very few supported regions at the moment. So what would happen if some of my resources are in the unsupported region?
So today, if you have resources, this is just where your agent connects to, right? This is just where to which region. So you can basically, I could now connect my server running here in Europe, and I connect it to the South Asia region, right? I could connect it there. Could also connect it to the US region. Obviously, it makes sense to connect it to the closest region, and there will be more regions available over time, right? At the beginning, I think we only had 3 regions available. Now we already have 4. But again, this is a little bit limited because we are in public preview.
Okay. Any other question from the attendees? You can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Looks like somebody has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
And no worries if someone wants to follow up later or a question pops in your mind. Again, you can reach me on my Twitter handle or on my blog. Just reach out to me and ask the question. And if I can answer them, I will try to help you. Otherwise, I will try to find out. I'm also very interested in your feedback. Do you think this is something which is great? What is missing? What do you want? I think that is very important to understand from your side, because we have a couple of ideas and the team is obviously working on this, but we also we really want to make that about what is important for the specific customers who want to use it. What is the things which are missing? What are the things you want to use? What are the things which would actually block you from using this? So if you have any feedback, again, you don't need to share it right now, you can, but you can also just reach out to me later on.
Hey, Thomas, I have a question specific to Kubernetes deployment. So just trying to understand, is there any requirement in terms of you got to use Azure DevOps, or can they just have their existing pipelines and have it deployed across multiple clusters? And if so, where do you see the deployment status coming in? Where do they have to go to monitor that?
Yes. So that's a very good question. Excellent. Because I did not talk too much about the Kubernetes part, but first of all, which is like part of your answer maybe, but not really. But I think it's a lot of interest for a lot of other people as well. You can run that with basically any kind of Kubernetes solution, right? This is not, we have a couple of supported Kubernetes distributions out there, but for example, if you run OpenShift, that also Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes will also work with OpenShift Kubernetes clusters and so on. Now, you don't need to use Azure DevOps at all for this. So how it actually works is that we're using a GitOps pipeline. So what we have is a Git repository. This can be a private repository or a public repository. This can be on GitHub or anywhere else, basically. It just needs to be accessible, obviously, from the Kubernetes cluster. And then if we check in code into this, this will then go out and be deployed on that specific cluster. So there's no dependencies on Microsoft products or services in that case. You can just, the only thing you basically need, if you make it very easy, you need a Git repository, which can be accessible by the cluster. But there's some great documentation out there already, like explaining how to set this up. I will try to record a video in the next couple of days to show a little bit more about this. But again, there is some on Microsoft Docs. You can already find the documentation if you're looking for Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Then you will find how, first of all, how to join that cluster, like just how I showed you basically with the server, but also how to set up this app deployment model. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, man. That was good. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vinod, for asking that question. Any other question? I think we are almost on time. So before we close down, we have Patrick Beamer from Singapore, Microsoft, and he has a little announcement to make. Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, no major announcement really, but first, thank you very much, Thomas, for joining us in Singapore. It's nice of you to join us on Europe time. Really appreciate it. And I think this was really insightful also to get a proper demo of what the product actually looks like. I just wanted to let people know that on June 24th, we're going to have a hybrid event that is obviously going to touch on Arc, but also to Thomas' earlier point, how does Arc fit together with Azure Stack and other part of the Microsoft portfolio? And it will also be a chance to hear from some of the early adopter customers. So what has kind of been the customer experience? It won't be as technical as this session, but it will probably give you a bit of a sense of how customers are taking advantage of this new technology. So I shared that in the IM window already, the link to that session.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for that. So I think with that, we can conclude this session. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks a lot for taking time out of your busy schedule and conducting this session. I hope sometime once things get normalized, we'll see you in Singapore, maybe for Ignite or some other major event.
I hope so too. Thank you very much for having me. It was an honor to be here this evening for you. And again, hope to see you soon in person.
Yeah. Would you be able to share the slide deck with the attendees?
Absolutely. Yeah, I will send it to you and you can share it out.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Perfect.
Have a nice
Thank
day.
you. Thanks
Thank you so
too.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.